Salutations everyone, my name is Morgan Osbin, and for the past few weeks I have been creating a 2D and 3D VTuber model to showcase how someone can make one for themselves. And this video serves as both a time-lapse and slight commentary on how I make them now in 2025. Now there are a few things that changed since last time I made a VTuber model in this channel. One wherein I do not need to use Unity anymore to make the 3D VRM version of this character. So if you want to skip to that part, I'll provide timestamps to that and some commentary bits down in the description of this video. Now, on with the time-lapse. So to recap how I make a VTuber, I do it differently from others. I usually start off with a rough concept art of my character in a drawing program like Krita, then immediately go on to making a 3D model in Blender. This is because I wanted to know how my character looks in all different angles, and I can't imagine that in a 2D art program. This will make setting up the 2D rig much more efficient for me, especially when I start making my head rotation parameters in a 2D rigging software in Inochi. But let's ignore that for a second and instead see what I am doing now in Blender. Importing my concept art into Blender, I start off by blocking out parts of my character's main body with primitive meshes in Blender like spheres and cubes, then combining them using a boolean modifier. Ignore the large vertex count for now. Some parts like the dress is made using box modeling, a technique I wrongly called vertex by vertex modeling in the last video I did on making 3D VTuber models, but it's essentially when you add a plane and make vertices little by little to make a 3D shape. I see this method being used a lot in making 3D VRM models, but for me personally, I don't like how it usually results in a low vertex count and a mesh that is hard to shape and manipulate, so only use it exclusively on things I know would not have a complex shape to them, like clothing. The hair is made using curves because they are much easier to manipulate than normal meshes in Blender. However, curves aren't accepted as definite meshes in the VRM format, so I have to turn it into a mesh via the F3 shortcut after reducing its resolution in the Properties panel in the right side of my screen. Alright, it is now time to address the large vertex count of my main body. To fix that, I import a plane, turn on the snapping tool, and add a mirror modifier, a subdivision modifier, and a shrinker modifier under my plane's modifiers panel. I go down to edit mode and place my mesh's vertices right on top of the surface of my main body. This is easy to do because of the snapping tool I enabled before. Then, one by one, I recreate the entire shape of my body by adding more vertices to my plane. We call this process retopology, and eventually I will have to replace the hard sculpt model with this less dense model. When I am done reshaping everything, I create another copy of my retopo model, apply its mirror modifier, and in place all other modifiers with the multi-res modifier. This will make the shape permanent once I get rid of the hard sculpt model. Next comes UV editing. This is when I plot how my texture will be laid out on my 3D model. I don't really have anything else to add here that I haven't said before, so I will instead read an excerpt of my script from the Art of Making 3D VTuber Models video. If you've ever wrapped a Christmas gift before, then you probably know the basics of 3D UV editing. In a Christmas wrapping setting, your model is the unwrapped box, and the wrapping is a 3D image that you will design on your own that will serve as its external appearance. But before you get into wrapping a Christmas gift, you will first form jagged lines around the wrapping for cutting so that it can easily cover your gift without any crumples. This jagged line framework in 3D texturing is called a UV map, and they are 2D references that Blender uses to plan how an image texture would wrap around my 3D model. It is hard to explain how I make UV maps in Blender without derailing this video, but to summarize, I go into the mindset thinking that my model is already wrapped head to toe with wrapping paper. I would then mark out edges of my model in red that I would call the cutting lines. Essentially, by marking these lines in red, I'm telling Blender to cut these edges and lay the fallen pieces flat into a 2D image. It will trace the shape of these fallen pieces until I get the UV map that I wanted. Once I have the UV map, I can finally start coloring my VTuber model.
Toxic love, look how you make me happy. You take a hold of me. You take a hold of wish I could give you up, but you're my new favorite drug. Enter into my blood, run with my toxic love. Look how you make me happy. You take a hold of me. You take a hold of me. You take a hold of
Alright, so next thing is texturing. One thing I kind of discovered when making textures now is that there is a way to mask different faces of a mesh to make quick texture jobs like the socks of my character. As for setting up the toon shade of my character, I installed an add-on called VRM Format by Saturday06 that not only gives me the ability to export as a .vrm format in Blender, but also allows me to streamline the making of a toon shader by just clicking a checkbox called Enable VRM mToon Material down in the Material tab of my meshes. Now it's time to add the rig of my model. My sister came in during this part of my procedure, so just ignore the head sticking out beside me. Instead of making my own armature, I decided to use the armature provided by the add-on for compatibility purposes. Now I adjust the shape of the armature to the shape of my mesh, delete some unnecessary bones, automatically create weight paints on my meshes, and adjust the weight paints as I wish.
Said I made up my mind this time. I'm taking it over. Modest tranquility. Said I made up my mind this time. I'm taking it over. Hey,
Next is to add the shape keys. The add-on already has slots to where I could put shape keys for when my character does stuff like blink her eyes, make a facial expression, and say the 5 vowel sounds. So I first make the shape keys themselves in Blender, then bind them to the VRM add-on. When I am done, I go through the file drop-down menu, export as a VRM, then I am finished. This is the final result of what I've made in Blender, but we are not done yet, because it is time to make a 2D version of this in Krita and Inochi. To start, I rendered my character looking in all 4 directions as a PNG, then import them to Krita as reference to know how I should create the layers of my character. I also rendered my VTuber model doing a default standing pose and began tracing her proportions layer by layer. Some parts are to be masked because when you finally start rigging the character, some layers have to extend to quite a degree without poking out of certain areas. So to make sure things still look pretty and organized, I put them under a mask. When all layers are fixed, I import them to Inochi session and redo all the masks I made because mask information do not transfer between Krita and Inochi. Then I start making the shape keys using my post sheet as a reference. Most people would also want to edit the mesh of the character in this step, but for my case, since she is a very simple character, I only edited the vertices of her mouth and kept everything to have for vertices. In Inochi's session, I made sure all of the face tracking is working perfectly. Using the numbers displayed on the right, which represent my tracking information, I adjust the tracking in range for each of my character's parameters and adjust the damping number to make sure the model moves smoother. And that's how I made both the 2D and 3D version of this VTuber model. If you like what you see, be sure to support me on Ko-Fi, and as always, go read a book.